The greatest philosopher-king in history raised the worst emperor Rome ever had. His own son, Marcus Aurelius, the man who wrote Meditations, the emperor who held the Roman Empire together through plague and war. He could not reach the person sleeping in the next room. This is the story that nobody in Stoicism wants to talk about, because it breaks something. It breaks the idea that if you think right, choose right, and live right, you can control the outcome. Marcus Aurelius did everything right. His son became a disaster anyway. And this matters, not because it's interesting history, but because it teaches us the most painful lesson Stoicism has to offer. That virtue isn't a guarantee. That effort doesn't ensure results. That you can do everything correctly and still lose. The outcome is not yours to control. Commodus was born into a world of privilege. His father was emperor. His teachers included some of the finest Stoic philosophers in the world. Epictetus's teachings were still fresh. Marcus Aurelius himself guided his education. The boy had every advantage. He had the wisdom of the greatest mind of his age, and he wanted none of it. Instead, Commodus wanted spectacle. He wanted power without the weight of duty. He wanted the adulation of crowds, not the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Marcus could see this clearly. He watched his son reject everything he valued, and Commodus felt none of the weight that his father carried every single day. The irony is brutal. Commodus had advantages almost no one has ever had. He was raised by the most thoughtful, most philosophical mind of his generation. He had access to wisdom. He had models of virtue. He had every chance, and none of it mattered because he didn't want it, and wanting is not something you can force into someone else. Marcus Aurelius had a blind spot. It was the only place his clarity failed him. He could see the universe clearly. He could diagnose his own faults with devastating precision. He could work through the hardest philosophical problems in his journal at night. But he could not see his own son, or perhaps he saw him and could not accept what he saw. This is important, because it tells us something about the limits of philosophy. Even the best mind, even the clearest thinker, even someone who has mastered virtue and reason, they can still miss what's right in front of them. They can still hope where they should see clearly. They can still love someone beyond what wisdom would recommend. There are scholars who argue Marcus knew exactly what Commodus was, and he named him heir anyway. Why would a philosopher-king do that? The answer is simpler than you think. It was duty. It was dynasty. It was the limits of Stoic detachment meeting the limits of a father's influence. When Commodus took power, everything changed. Within months, the gladiator arenas became his obsession. Within a year, he was fighting in them himself, a Roman emperor descending into the sand playing the role of a slave. Marcus would have been horrified. He would have seen it as the ultimate perversion of duty, power, and virtue. He was already dead by then. He never knew how completely his son would reject everything he had stood for. Commodus ruled for 13 years of madness. He renamed Rome after himself. He had statues of himself everywhere. He appointed himself to priesthoods. He spent the empire's wealth like water. He executed senators on whim. Everything Marcus had built, everything Marcus had stood for, his own son systematically dismantled it. The philosophers of Rome watched this happen and couldn't explain it. How could the author of Meditations produce an heir like this? The answer they came up with was bitter. They said Marcus loved his son too much. They said fatherly affection clouded his judgment. But that's not quite right either. Marcus Aurelius understood something that most people never learn. He understood the dichotomy of control. You control your choices, you control your effort, you control your response. You do not control others, you do not control outcomes. You do not control whether the seeds you plant will grow. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things entirely. Marcus knew he couldn't control Commodus, but he was human, he was a father, he hoped, he tried, and when it failed, he had to live with it. Here's what people miss about Stoicism. It's not about controlling everything. It's about freedom within what you actually control. Marcus could control his own virtue. He did that. He controlled his response to failure. He did that. What he couldn't control was whether his son would choose wisdom or madness, and that drove a wedge through everything he believed. Some historians say Commodus was probably mentally ill. Some say he was a psychopath. Some say he was simply spoiled. The truth doesn't really matter for this lesson. The point is that Marcus did what you're supposed to do. He taught. He modeled virtue. He created an environment where wisdom was possible, and his son chose differently. This is the most brutal application of the dichotomy of control. You can plant seeds. You can tend the garden. You can create the conditions for growth. You cannot force the flower to bloom. You cannot force your children to want what you want. You cannot force them to choose what you've chosen. And here's what makes it even harder. Sometimes the best gardener produces the most twisted tree. Sometimes the wisest parent raises the most foolish child, not because the parent failed, but because the child is not a puppet. The child is a human being with their own will, and that will might be pointed in exactly the opposite direction from where you hoped. The challenge Marcus faced is the same challenge every parent faces. Every mentor faces it. Every teacher faces it. You can show someone the way, you cannot walk it for them. And sometimes, despite everything, they choose a different path. Marcus had to live with that. He had to watch Commodus destroy Rome. He had to know that his legacy would be undone almost immediately after his death. And he had to accept that this was beyond his control. Not because he didn't care, but because caring doesn't give you power over someone else's choices. This is where Stoicism gets hard. It's not hard in the morning when you're motivated. It's hard when your influence fails, when the person you love chooses differently, when your example doesn't work, when your wisdom bounces off someone who refuses to listen. Marcus lived it, he accepted it, because that's what the dichotomy of control actually means. You do your part, you live your values, you offer your wisdom, and then you release the outcome. You let other people be other people, you let them make their own mistakes, you let them be different from you. Here's the hard truth. Your children might not turn out how you hope. Your influence might fail. Your example might not work. The person you're trying to help might not want help. These are things you cannot control. But what you can control is whether you try anyway. What you can control is showing up with integrity. What you can control is offering wisdom without demanding compliance. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as the greatest emperor Rome ever had. His son is remembered as a punchline, a cautionary tale, proof that even genius doesn't guarantee results. But here's what matters. Marcus lived his values. He did his duty. He taught his son. And when his son rejected it, Marcus accepted that rejection. That's the lesson nobody wants to hear. That's the story that breaks the idea of guaranteed outcomes. And that's exactly why we need to hear it. You control your actions. You control your effort. You control whether you show up with integrity. You do not control other people. You do not control whether they listen. You do not control whether they change. You do not control what they become. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. You've offered what you have to offer. Now take what's left and live it properly. Don't waste what remains trying to control what you never could control. If you have children or anyone you mentor, ask yourself this today. Are you trying to control who they become, or are you equipping them to choose for themselves? Marcus did everything right. Commodus still chose his own path, the The painful truth is this. You can plant seeds, you can water them, you can give them the best soil and the best light, but you cannot force them to grow. This is what the dichotomy of control actually costs, and this is where Stoicism becomes real.